To be here. And today I'm going to talk about a joint project with Eric Lundberg, who is also a PhD student at Uppsala University. And I'm going to talk about what happened when Sweden made it significantly easier for a set of skilled workers to settle permanently in Sweden. As you will see, this kind of set of skilled workers are, I think probably almost all of the panelists, basically PhD students. Great. Just to motivate it a little bit. So we all know that skilled immigration can contribute to innovation and economic growth. And I think we constantly hear about aging populations that many OECD countries are facing. We also hear about labor shortages, particularly in high-growth, skill-intensive STEM sectors. So many OECD countries, and even I think developing countries, are kind of struggling with these issues around labor shortage, right? And already some of those countries have started to use targeted migration policies to attract and retain skilled international workers, right? So you can think about these preferential tax schemes, and there's a bunch of papers kind of looking into the efficacy of these schemes in attracting skilled immigrants. You can also think about specialized work permits that many countries are issuing, right? So you have for the US, you have Einstein visa, and I think there are kind of similar schemes in many other countries. In Europe, for example, I think Sweden has introduced now expedited visa processes for certain very highly paid skilled workers. I know that Germany has recently passed laws that make it significantly easier for naturalization of certain high-skilled workers. So many countries are taking concrete steps to address some of these problems. Now, in this context, international students emerge as a potential pool of skilled workers, right? But whether or to what extent we can actually kind of draw from this pool depends on how well these students can be integrated into the host country's labor market. Now, what factors shape the location choices of these international students? So one can think about labor market opportunities both back home, so where they come from, and also in the destination countries. And at the same time, migration policies around prospect for naturalization or prospect for permanent settlement in the destination country, that might also matter. That brings me to the research question, that how does an easier pathway to permanent settlement affect international doctoral students? And this is in the context of Sweden. So today I'm going to talk about the choices these international doctoral students make in three key domains. So one is whether they're staying in Sweden in the long run, and then whether they're investing in host country specific skills, and I'm going to talk about their propensity to take up Swedish language training, and also what are they doing in terms of family formation. And both of these choices are made during the PhDs, right? So these kind of forward-looking individuals, now that they know that it's getting easier for me to settle in Sweden in the long run, does that make them, or does that encourage them to invest in language learning, even in the short run, or to make choices in terms of family formation during their PhD. Right? So just to keep in mind, these last two choices will be measured during the PhD. And in the future, we are kind of collecting a database on academic output. So what are they doing during the PhD? And if they stay in academia, what are they doing kind of their post-PhD? And I think one kind of attractive feature of this database would be that we will actually be able to see where they're going when they're kind of not staying in Sweden, both pre and post-reform. So I think that would be a nice feature of this data set. We're also thinking about, I think, scraping LinkedIn to see that those who do not stay in academia, what are they kind of doing with their occupational status or their location choice. And lastly, we are also in the process of getting ethical approval to get administrative data on mental health outpatient and inpatient visits, and also kind of prescription drug take-up. We all know that mental health issues are pervasive among PhD students, I think even more so in economics. And I think some of these mental health issues stem from these visa-related uncertainties for the international students who have to kind of go through these processes to maintain their student status and eventually to kind of to settle in a country if they want to. Great. Just to give you guys a kind of preview of what we do and what we find. So we're going to use variation from a reform in 2014 that relaxed the requirements for permanent residence for international doctoral students in Sweden. So what we mean by international doctoral students, that kind of differs based on the context. For Sweden or for countries in the EU, that means what they call students from these kind of third countries. So that's basically students from outside the European Union or the European Economic Area. Right? So for people like me coming from Bangladesh, or for example, coming from China or coming from Argentina. Great, so what did the reform do? So the reform reduced the residence requirement from 8 to 4 years. So after 4 years of spending time in Sweden as a doctoral student, they will be eligible to apply for permanent residency. And then their partners were also allowed to work during the PhD. So the partners would get a work permit by default. So for identification, we are going to use a standard difference in differences design with European and Swedish doctoral students as the comparison group. What we find, so the ATT estimates for international students in those three domains that we talked about, findings suggest that these treated international students are more likely to stay in Sweden 3 years post-graduation by 23%. During the PhD, these treated international students are also more likely to take up Swedish for immigrants, this publicly provided free language program. And lastly, again, during the PhD, they form marriage or get into registered partnership at a higher rate, right? So they're kind of in three significant domains, this reform seems to have had an effect. And we just saw that one other component of the reform was that if a PhD student had a partner at any point during the PhD, that partner would be allowed to work. So the reform didn't have any effect on those partners. So we do have some evidence on that. So the partners of these international students are also more likely to take up this language training program while their spouse is doing the PhD. So they're 3.3 percentage points more likely to enroll at Swedish for immigrants. And their employment rate also goes up by almost 5 percentage points or 17%. So overall, kind of the two major components of the reform, so one kind of targeting the international students and the other relaxing labor market entry constraints for the partners, both of these seem to have had substantive effects on some key choices made by the students or their partners. Great, so we believe that we are kind of contributing to two broad strands of literature. So as I already mentioned, there is a group of papers that look at the role of preferential tax schemes, for example, tax breaks for certain high-skilled workers, and how that influences skilled immigration. So there's a group of papers looking into that. And there is also a set of papers that look into the effects of similar policies that make naturalization or permanent residence easier for different choices made by refugees or low-skilled immigrants. So we are contributing by providing new evidence on the efficacy of those kinds of policies that facilitate permanent residency and family reunification in retaining or attracting international talents. Second, we're also shedding light on how changes in these migration rules can shape integration, family formation, and in the future health outcomes of these high-skilled immigrants. So right now, most of the literature kind of focuses on refugees or low to middle skilled immigrants. And lastly, I think it has also some policy implications. So just as a note, and this doesn't affect the empirical analysis that we do in the paper, so some of the rules of this reform were actually kind of reversed in July 2021. And right now there is a kind of discussion by the current government of whether to kind of go back to what the kind of reform implemented and what are the kind of pros and cons. So there is a kind of robust discussion that's going on. So we're also kind of hoping to contribute to that policy discussion as well. So we are actually kind of working on some popular articles that will kind of eventually release so that we can help policymakers make some of the decisions. Great. So I'm going to talk about the reform and give some institutional background. Then I'll move on to describing the data and the empirical design, followed by the results, and finally I will conclude. I'll just kind of pause a little bit and see if there are any questions. Are there any kind of clarification questions or no? Great. Okay. So what are the rules for permanent settlement before this reform for the international doctoral students? So basically what happened is that if you come in to Sweden as a PhD student, you get a student residence permit. And once you kind of graduate, then you kind of, if you choose to stay, then you have to work for at least 4 years to be able to apply for permanent residency. So that basically meant that, you know, you are considered as a labor migrant once you graduate, and then the rules for permanent residency that apply to labor migrant also apply to those students. And that's kind of, you have to work for 4 years out of the last 7 years to be able to apply for permanent residency. So that effectively meant that, you know, you can apply for permanent settlement after 8 or 9 years at the very least. And your partners were not entitled to a work permit. They could get a work permit, but that would be as a labor migrant. So you'd have to have an employer sponsor you to be able to work in Sweden. So there was already some discussions in the middle of 2013 around kind of how these restrictions were discouraging some of the PhD students to stay in Sweden in the long run. And we are actually kind of going to account for that by allowing an anticipation cohort. Great. So what did the reform do? As I have already mentioned to some extent, that it allowed the PhD students to use the years of PhD when applying for permanent residence permit. So basically, they are coming in effectively as a labor migrant. And once they have spent 4 years out of the last 7 years as a PhD student, they can apply for permanent residence. Yes, that effectively meant that you do not have to wait for 8 to 9 years. You can apply for permanent residency after 4 or 5 years. That's a kind of significant reduction in the residence requirement before you can get to the point of getting a permanent residence permit. And at the same time, it issued work permit by default to the partner. So if you had a partner of when you came in as a PhD student, or if you had a partner at some point during the PhD, your partner would be automatically allowed to work in Sweden. So he or she could apply to any jobs without any other restrictions. And also importantly, they would be able to jointly apply for permanent residence permits when the main applicant, so there's the PhD student, had spent 4 out of the last 7 years as a PhD student, right? And there was no employment requirement that was imposed on the partner, right? So as long as the PhD student kind of met the requirement, they could jointly apply for permanent residency, irrespective of whatever the partner was doing. So in terms of timeline, it was actually kind of pretty quick. You already saw that there was some discourse happening, but in terms of the actual logistics of the law, so the proposal was introduced to the parliament let me just go to the slide. So it was introduced to the parliament in March 2014. It was passed in June, and then it was implemented from July 2014. So it was kind of from proposal to implementation, it basically took 3 to 4 months. So it was kind of fairly quick once it was introduced to the parliament. Great. So how should we think about it? Kind of theoretically, what are the choices that we are discussing? So international students, and I think that many panelists and also I think many of the crowd can relate to these choices. So they're making basically 2 choices, right? So where do I go for studies, and then where to settle after graduation, right? And for folks who are kind of lucky enough to have, two PhD offers from two different countries, the second choice, that whether I would settle in this country after graduation, that can actually have some influence on the first option, right? So I can again kind of talk about myself. I had kind of one other offer from a university in the UK, but that was also the time when kind of Brexit was happening. So I thought, okay, maybe that given that level of kind of economic and political instability, it might be better for me to kind of go to Sweden, but it would be perhaps kind of easier to settle in the long run, right? But of course, there is a substantive lag between these two decisions, right? So you kind of start a PhD, kind of you get the information about this country, you get more information about the labor market, about the social environment, about the cultural environment, and of course, personal circumstances change, migration rules change, and then probably there is a significant probability that there is a separation between these two decisions, right? And they kind of diverge from each other. Now, one could question that there were restrictions before this reform, because the students had to wait another 4 years to get permanent residency. But did these constraints actually bind? Right. So it's, it could be many things that I'm already kind of calling them skilled immigrants, so they should be able to kind of get a job. So this constraint kind of might not bind, right? So it could be kind of fairly easy for them to get a job, and then it doesn't matter whether they have to kind of wait 4 more years, right? But at the same time, this you don't, after this reform, you don't have to kind of go through that hassle of kind of renewing your permit every couple of years. And then, of course, there is always a kind of a tail probability of something happening that creates issues with your visa or your kind of likelihood of staying in the country, right? So it kind of reduces residence uncertainty, and in turn decreases the perceived cost of staying in the destination country, right? And at the same time, I think we have to note that since the reform allows you to get permanent residency in 4 or 5 years, that also means that you can also get the citizenship in a fairly short time. So permanent residency, of course, is a kind of prerequisite to getting citizenship. And this reform effectively meant that you could get, in theory, the Swedish citizenship within 5 or 6 years. That's kind of fairly quick in compared to many other OECD countries. So it then kind of increases the relative attractiveness of Sweden as a country to settle in. But at the same time, I think once you get the citizenship, then you're actually you don't have to stay in Sweden to be to benefit from the citizenship of Sweden, right? And at the same time, I think many of us international students know that with that kind of passport, I think you can you can get an easier access to basically the global level, right? So that would also decrease your probability of staying in Sweden in the long run, right? So overall, it's an empirical question of what would actually happen in terms of their propensity to stay in Sweden in the long run. And given this this future choice of whether I'll be staying in Sweden, so if I am more likely to stay in Sweden in the long run, then do I make investments that are specific to Sweden, right? So one major such investment is, of course, kind of learning Swedish, and whether this reform makes me more likely to invest in this particular skill. But I think, like residency, one could also argue that since it becomes kind of easier to get permanent residency, and I have to note that, there is no formal language requirement to get permanent residency, and not even for citizenship in Sweden. So it's not a requirement in any sense. It's kind of a voluntary investment. And of course, many of us are doing a PhD, so we can kind of temporarily defer this investment, right? That, I can get, there's no kind of issues with getting permanent residency. I can get it kind of easily once I finish the PhD. I can probably kind of focus on my research, and I can kind of invest in the language later. So there is no kind of clear prediction from the theory that we can get in terms of this integration investment. And lastly, if this reform reduces residence uncertainty, it can also reduce the cost of family formation. and that can influence the students' rate of marriage or partnership and even fertility, right? Okay, so just, everyone hears about, the beautiful work-life balance that Scandinavia has. So I was hoping to learn some of that, but obviously I have learned none of it, because I have I'm working on policies that kind of simultaneously affect me. I have this kind of weird reaction to any migratory policy reform in Sweden. At first, I think my first impression is, can I use this variation to say something useful about human behavior? At the same time, I'm like, does this policy affect me? Right? So there's kind of no healthy work-life balance there. And just this kind of screenshot from probably exploiting my personal misery at this point. So I had to kind of withdraw my permanent residency application to be able to kind of travel, represent at some conferences, because it seemed like there would be a kind of long delay in getting a decision on that. So the choice was kind of basically foregoing all those conferences and waiting to get a decision, or to withdraw my permanent residency application and to get a kind of a temporary extension on my student visa. And I had to kind of do that. Great. So that's kind of an unnecessary tangent. Let me move to talking about the data and design. We have compiled different sets of administrative data. I'm going to just note that on one of these variables, we are kind of constraints. That's kind of critical for the empirical analysis. That's kind of country of birth, which we need to know to define treatment and control. So we do not have for all the countries the exact country of birth. So these are in our data set, this kind of common country group. So that kind of artificially reduces the number of clusters we have. Great. So where's the design? So obviously the reform does not apply to the Swedes and not the kind of other European migrant students that are kind of coming into Sweden as PhD students from other countries that are part of the EU or EEA. So we are going to use them as control group, and these kind of third country international students as the treatment group. That's kind of one variation. And the other variation would come from this reform in 2014. So that gives us the standard difference in differences. Right, so for the study population, we are using the cohorts that graduate between 2008 to 2017, leaving us with just over 25,000 PhD students. To avoid any issues that could come from any selection of the incoming cohorts after this reform came in, we are going to kind of restrict the sample to students who registered before the reform came into effect. What are the typical identifying assumptions? These are kind of standard assumptions, parallel trends, stable unit treatment value assumptions, the assumption that concurrent shocks would not differentially affect the international students. So these shocks could be kind of back in their home, any kind of macroeconomic shocks. That could be kind of some shocks in Sweden that specifically apply to international students, but not the other students. And of course, there cannot be any kind of selection into treatment. So this is the basic setup. So the regression specification is the typical two-way fixed effects definitive specification. So we have a few covariates that are measured when the students start the PhD. We have the country group fixed effects and also the time fixed effects. And so beta is going to be our ATT estimate of the effect of the reform on the international students that graduate after the reform. Okay, so we are also going to present results stratified by exposure. So how are we going to do that? So this is the kind of the first stratum that's going to be the cohorts that graduate in 2013 and 14. As I mentioned before, so the 2013 cohort is kind of the anticipation cohort because there is already some discussion going in. And technically, they could actually kind of benefit from this reform if they were staying in Sweden in 2014. So retrospectively, they could use this reform as long as they had finished the PhD in 4 or more years. But at the same time, these cohorts kind of got exposed to the reform later in their PhD, so they had limited time, for example, to make an investment in language or make similar changes in family formation, right? So they got exposed relatively late during their studies. And then the cohorts that graduated between 2015 and 17, so those had a longer exposure to the knowledge of the reform, so they had probably kind of more time to show some of these kind of behavioral responses in the domain of language and family formation. So we are using event studies specification, again, standard for pretest and to show effect dynamics. And lastly, as I said, that we have kind of, and I think artificially so, a few clusters, since we have information on only the country groups. So we are, apart from cluster robust inference, we're also going to show wild bootstrap standard errors given the limited number of clusters. Great. Let's move on to results. So first, some simple summary statistics. So there we have the kind of three groups of students. We have the Swedes, the European migrant international students, and then the international students. Right, so there obviously are some differences in terms of age. The Europeans and the internationals are kind of fairly similar, but the international students are, for example, less likely to be female compared to the other two groups, and they're also more likely to enroll at STEM fields. Great. So, which countries are the kind of major suppliers of these international students? So I think this is actually kind of fairly similar across the major receivers of the students. So if you look at the distribution of international PhD students in the US or in Germany, I think they're kind of fairly similar. So we have almost over 40% of students coming from North Asia. So that's China, Japan, South Korea, etc. And then 25% from South or Southeast Asia. So that's Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka. And then we have almost 20% from Turkey, Iran, or Iraq. So that's kind of, I think, one exception, and that's due to this kind of historically a large Iranian diaspora being in Sweden. So I think Iran supplies almost 10% of all international students. So I think that's kind of one significant difference from what you might see, for example, in the US or in Germany. So who are the major suppliers from within the European Union or European Economic Area? So almost over 50% come from Northwestern EU. So that's kind of Germany, France, UK, those countries. We have some from Southern EU, and the rest comes from Nordic countries, and then also from Eastern European Union countries as well. Since a lot of time was spent on creating the map, I'm going to show the map as well. So this is kind of just how the map looks, and in terms of the distribution of the share of students. As I say, I think there's a kind of high representation of North and South Asia on the international students. Great, how do we go back? Great, okay. So first I'm going to talk about probability of staying in Sweden in the long run, and this kind of, we are looking at the raw data, and we have these three groups. So first, as you might expect, the Swedish doctoral graduates, I think they're staying in Sweden at a pretty high rate, I think close to 96%. So most of them stay in Sweden and do not migrate out of Sweden. And then if you look at the European students and the international students, both in terms of levels and trajectories, they kind of closely track each other before this reform happened. As you can clearly see, the trends diverge once this reform comes into place, providing some kind of suggestive evidence that this reform had some bite on the propensity to stay in Sweden in the long term for the treated international students. So this is kind of the corresponding event study using both the Swedish and European doctoral graduates in the control group. So as the descriptive graph suggested, we can clearly see positive effects on the probability of staying in Sweden 3 years post-graduation for the treated international graduates, and this effect kind of grows over time. This could be for multiple reasons. That could be kind of, the latter cohorts learning from the earlier cohorts. It could be network externalities. it could also be that these latter cohorts had more time to actually kind of prepare better for their permanent settlement in Sweden. We get similar results when we just use the Europeans in the control group with a bit of larger confidence intervals, because we lose some power when we drop the Swedes from the control group. Great. So this is the corresponding regression results, and let me just kind of take some time to walk you guys through the format of the table, because this will kind of the structure will be repeated in more slides. So in the odd columns, we have both the Europeans and the Swedes in the comparison group, and in the even columns, we are dropping the Swedes from the comparison group. In the first two columns, we have the pool results, so we are not stratifying by cohorts. So in columns 3 and 4, we are just looking at the late exposed cohorts, so who got exposed to reform pretty late during their PhD. So that's cohorts that graduated in 2013 and 14. And then in columns 5 and 6, we're looking at the cohorts that got exposed to this reform earlier in their PhD. So that's the cohorts between 2015 and 17. So overall, the reform increased the long-term residency rates of treated international graduates by over 13 percentage points. So in relative terms, that's kind of 23% compared to the pre-reform mean for international graduates. And as you can clearly see, this effect is substantially higher for the cohorts that graduate between 2015 to 17, as we saw in the event study graph. Great. So now you might wonder, and I think there is a lot of history saying, how what happens to the natives when there is a kind of an inflow of immigrants. So there could be a kind of a similar concern here as well, that are we kind of violating the Sudha assumption, right? So are these, as we have already seen, these treated international graduates, they are more likely to stay. Does that have any influence on the location choice of their peers? So both the Swedish graduates and also the European graduates, right? So we can use an IV difference in differences design. So you can think about it being kind of a shift share design, and we know that either the shift or the share would have to be exogenous. So in this case, the shares are pre-reformed shares of international graduates across 60 different research fields, and there is considerable variation, as we can see here. And then the exogenous shift comes from the 2014 reform. Right, so what do we find? So overall, we do not find any evidence of crowding out. So the higher probability of this international graduates staying in Sweden that do not have a negative effect on the probability of their Swedish or European peers settling in Sweden in the long run. So for the Swedes, both OLS and IV estimates are positive, but kind of imprecisely estimated. So if anything, we find that there could be some crowding in. So if you look at column 4, which is the IV estimate from the IV difference in differences model, so one more international peers staying in Sweden, that leads to a 1 percentage points higher probability of a European peer from the same research field staying in Sweden in the long run, right? So that also means that we are probably underestimating the effects for sure on long-term residency. But as long as that choice to settle in the long run kind of correlates with, for example, my choice to learn a language, and also to kind of form families, that might also mean that we might also be underestimating effects on those margins as well. So that's, I think, good to keep in mind. We do some calculations in the paper, for example, to show that this actually kind of can help us reconcile some of the differences that we see for the HP estimates that we get when you use both Swedes and Europeans in the control group versus when we only use Europeans in the control group. Great. So what happens in terms of these international students enrollment at Swedish Americans, which again is a publicly funded free language program? And I think I should mention that this is not a kind of a light touch program. This requires a kind of lot of investment. So the typical kind of time investment that you'd have to make, these are kind of you'd have to kind of go to classes for 5 or 6 hours every week, and I think the typical courses that you take would probably take, if you do it in one streak, it would probably take kind of 1 Yeah, of course, it will vary depending on the initial level of the PhD student, but I think it takes a significant time investment to go through these language courses. Okay, so
Akib, you have 5 minutes left.
5 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. When did we start? Okay, great. Yeah, so, and just to remind you that we are not obviously using the Swedes as a comparison group here, but the overall, otherwise the structure remains the same. We are kind of differentiating the two sets of cohorts based on the exposure to the reform. So overall, we find that the treated international students are 21% more likely to take up this language program during their PhD, with the effects again being higher for the cohorts that graduate later. So looking at the students who are kind of single at registration, we find that their marriage or partnership formation during the PhD increases by over 10%. And unsurprisingly, again, these effects are higher for the cohorts that graduate later during their PhD, because also they have kind of more time to respond to this reform and to make those choices. Great, so we have some additional results for family formation. So for example, we find that the treated international students show higher marital sorting by education, so they're more likely to have partners that have at least 2 years of university education. We see a decline in divorce or separation. That means that some matches on the margin, the marital surplus was probably raised by this reform. And then lastly, we did not find any effects on fertility. So we saw that the reform also had a component that relaxed the labor market entry constraints for the partners. So first we look at whether these partners increase their language investment as well. And just to note that this is coming from an unconditional nutrition, right? So the sample size remains the same. If you don't have a partner, you get a 0. If you have a partner that doesn't invest in language, they also get a 0. So if only you have a partner and they take up this language program, that gets a 1, right? So we can get a kind of causal interpretation in that way. So again, we are only using the European, the partners of the Europeans to do this exercise. And what we find that the treated international students partners also enroll in this language program at a higher rate by 17%. And does their employment get affected now that they don't have those restrictions on participating in the labor market? We find a positive effect on these partners' employment rate by close to 5 percentage points, or 7% compared to the pre-reform mean for the partners of international students. So overall, these partners are also more likely to take up language training. Their employment rate also goes up. So we looked into some dimensions of heterogeneity, and I think the kind of the highlight is that male and STEM students, they show larger treatment effects on both residency and language investments. Yeah, so as is the ritual, we do a bunch of robustness checks. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip some of that. Feel free to look at the paper to find about those. And lastly, and I think this is not in the paper, and again, I apologize, you kind of try to read it. So we do a kind of similar difference in difference exercise with the compliers. So that means who are staying insulin in the long term. And what we find is a non-significant negative effect on their average earnings 4 to 5 years after they graduated. But if you kind of take that estimate seriously, even if it's not significant, we can kind of locate these compliers below the counterfactual mean. So that's the kind of if you take the distribution of labor market outcomes for the always takers, they're slightly below the median in that particular distribution. But even then, we estimate that they contribute 24% higher than a similarly aged Swede in the distribution. So I also must note that I think there are kind of several measurement challenges. And the one key challenge is that so many of these if the student kind of stays in academia in Sweden after graduation, and over 40% of them do that, then, and if they take up some of these postdocs that are based on stipends, so that's basically non-taxable income, they actually kind of do not show up in the registered data that I use. So the registered data has this kind of drawback, and I think that kind of particularly bites for these international students, because anecdotally, they're actually kind of more likely to take up some of these fellowships, because that would kind of, I think, in many cases would help, for example, to make a down payment on if you want to kind of buy an apartment, because they come in kind of large tranches. So there, I think we are kind of severely underestimating the labor market outcomes by using this kind of data. Right, so even after
Akib, sorry, you have like 30 seconds to jump to the conclusion.
I'm done. So even after that kind of probable underestimation, we find that they're contributing way more compared to similarly aged individual among the Swedes. Great. Just to conclude, as you have seen, the reform increased the propensity of international doctoral students to stay in Sweden in the long run, and they're not crowding out any other doctoral graduates. And finally, this higher residence certainty also leads to these international doctoral graduates to invest more in learning Swedish, and they are observed to form partnerships at a higher rate. Their partners also are more likely to enroll in language training, and their employment rates also go up. So that's it.
Great. Thank you so much. We really appreciated the presentation. Super interesting paper. So I'm going to pass it on to Selena to do a 10-minute quick discussion. And then after that, we can take some of the questions from the chat. I see some folks have raised their hand.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I've also seen some questions, so I'll try to be brief so we have enough time for questions. But yeah, first of all, let me say that it was really a pleasure to read your paper, Akib. It's very well written and I really enjoyed it. I'll just very briefly summarize what you just said. So we're looking at a Swedish reform in 2014, which facilitated permanent residency and some other rights for PhD students in Sweden. And you look at how that reform impacted several dimensions, such as their permanent residency, their civil status, and also their language skills, by combining various data sets, which I think is something you didn't get to emphasize much in this talk, but it's a very nice data work. The questions you're trying to answer is mainly how this reform affected the post-PhD residency and then integration. You look at several heterogeneities. Then you focus quite a bit on how partners of PhD students were affected, and also answered a question on whether there were any crowding out effects on Swedish nationals with similar qualifications. So just also a bit of a recap of what I thought were like the key elements of this setup was that this reform came into effect in July 2014, and there was sort of a prehistory to it, even though since 2011 it wasn't brought up that much from what I understood. But then again, quite quickly in the second quarter of 2014 until it actually got enforced by July 2014. You rely on two control groups. So first, the just EU or EA students, or these students pooled with those who are actually Swedish, which gives you a larger sample size, but maybe a somewhat less comparable control group. And then you have a treatment group, and there you have basically one large group of students based on when they are actually graduating. So you're focusing on students who are graduating between 2013 and 2017. So even before the actual reform came into place, saying that you want to account for anticipation effects, and then you divide between those with short and long exposure to the knowledge of this reform. And then you look at heterogeneities, well, and as you said, male STEM students and those, you didn't say that now, but who are married or are more established, have family or so, are more likely to actually stay in Sweden. So some comments on this, hoping that these will help you to further improve the paper. I have three sort of larger comments and then a couple of minor ones. And I'm also happy to share more notes afterwards if you like. So the first comment is on this treatment group. I think one element that was lacking a bit for me is from the paper understanding a bit more precisely how one could get permanent residency, especially for those who graduated before the reform. So in the paper, it seemed to me that getting the PhD was enough of a qualification, but I'm not sure if this is more about the actual 4 years requirement that really matters. So just making that clear would be super helpful. And then you say, well, you have this treatment group from 2013 to 2017, and in your event study graphs, you basically normalize all the results to the 2013 graduate. There I was just wondering, from how I would usually think of an event study, I would take the last pre-reform or like the last control cohort as the normalized baseline, and then just look at the effects on the various treated cohorts. So I was just wondering how consistent is that with your definition of treatment group, or is that purposefully? I think it's just worth clarifying in the paper. So setting that aside, what is it about this 2013 cohort? You're saying, so they're staying in Sweden and they get the chance to apply, but that's also true for the 2012 cohort, and that's in the footnote. So why would we say 2013? We were giving them 1.5 years to apply after graduation in the longest case. That they have to stay after graduation to apply in the longest case. So what about if we exclude that from the treatment group, or if we exclude that overall because they are a bit special in that sense? So that's just one question. So I think that would be a nice robustness check. Similarly, I thought maybe it makes sense to think about people's starting date as the definition for whether we put them in the treatment or the control group. Because based on your starting date, there's also something like an expected graduation date. I know PhD students sometimes take a bit longer than the program's web suggests, but I think you could still find like a realistic assumption of how long does it take to do a PhD in economics. And that would make it a little bit more graspable for why you choose one cohort or another, because then you would actually say, well, people who have their expected graduation date after July 2014 are part of the treatment group. Then just a further idea, since we're talking about the treatment group, I think just excluding the half year before and after the reform in a sort of donut diff and diff would be a nice add-on to what you're already doing. But that's, I guess, a minor idea. Right, moving on to the next point. I think it would be nice to show even a bit more how the reform might have affected the timing of completion. And what I was thinking there is if you actually manage to have something like what's your expected graduation date and construct a running variable that shows how far is your expected graduation date from this July 2014 threshold, you could just run a typical Macquarie test to see whether there's any bundling in terms of how long people actually take to finish. But there again, I guess this depends a bit on the specifics of the reform, of whether this makes sense or whether you would want to look at that date or the 4-year threshold, but it's possible in both cases. Good. Finally, I think the composition of international students would be something that would deserve some more highlights. So there's some things in the appendix on how are they composed, but there's not so much on how does their composition change over time. So related to their origin, gender, maybe subjects as well. I think it would just be nice to show that that's smooth around the cutoff. It would also be interesting for maybe policymakers to look at how does the composition of new starters or also the completers change due to that reform. Are there specific country groups which maybe react more strongly to that? But again, that's more of an add-on. Finally, I won't go through all of this, but I think in general, a bit more on the institutional context for someone who's not so familiar with Sweden would be cool. What's the immigration history? I mean, you mentioned Iran right now. I happen to know that, but maybe that's good to know as well to understand the composition. How does tertiary education work? How accessible are these postdocs that you were referring to? What's the different legal treatment between being a partner and a spouse? and what are other ways to learn the language outside of these standardized public institutions. There's also some additional outcome variables that you might want to look at: completion rate, study duration, who are actually the new partners of the immigrants, if you know. And then finally, I really love the analysis with your shift share instrument on how any peer or crowding out effects realized around this reform. But I think you could, besides like this econometric, we have to comply with the Sutva assumption sort of framing, you could really go more for that cost effectiveness or policy type of argument of, hey, there is no crowding out. I think you changed that a bit from what you said now in the presentation, but I think there's a good argument to going for that sort of emphasis in this analysis. So I'll stop talking. Happy to clarify and to talk afterwards.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was a really nice discussion. So Akib, maybe I know there was a lot of content, but if you want to respond to anything that stood out to you in the discussion, any of the comments or ideas, you're welcome to do that. And then we can go to some of the questions in the chat.
Yeah, I mean, first, I mean, thanks a lot for, reading the paper. It's a kind of long paper. Yeah, just, I think to clarify the event study, I think the event study is still, so the baseline, so kind of, T0 is 2013, and kind of it's normalized at -1, which is kind of 2012, which is the first. Yeah, so I think just to clarify that, so I think we are still doing what we intended to do. And I think, I mean, the comment on kind of just using the start year as a kind of a different way to measure exposure to reform. So I think there is one table where we also add kind of start year fixed effects to kind of control for that. I think we also do, I think, in relation to, I think that's relates to the last point on selection into treatment, whether, some people who might have, I don't know, if someone is kind of, graduating in 2013, they might kind of extend a little bit just to have that sense, whether they have 4 years of PhD just to be able to satisfy the requirement if this reform comes into effect. So I think we have a robustness check where we exclude the 2009 cohort, if you recall correctly. So I mean, so when we look at the raw data, perhaps we should kind of put it in the paper. So based on the start year, so those kind of 2009 shows the cohorts that graduate in 2009, they should kind of some kind of changes in when they graduate. So there could be some kind of prolongation. So that's why we kind of do this robustness check, excluding that particular cohort who start in 2009 are expected to kind of finish around the cutoff. And we have kind of results, similar results, kind of doing that robustness check. What else? And I completely agree with your, that we can probably kind of do a little bit more in that kind of peer effects study for sure. I think we had some kind of pretty nice comments, for example, that, in terms of research productivity, now that, for example, if the supervisors are now a bit more productive, now that their kind of students are more likely to stay in Sweden. So I think there's kind of, it's beyond what you're doing or what's happening with your kind of to your peers within academia. I think it can also matter for the other people that you'd work with if you kind of choose to stay in Sweden, right? So yeah, I'll stop at that and then respond to other comments we might have.
Thank you so much, Akib, and thanks a lot, Selena, for such a great discussion. So there were other comments from the audience. Andres Ramas, unfortunately, he had to leave, but he mentioned that the reform had many components: the reduction in years needed for permanent residence, and the work permit since T = 0 is also for spouses. And if that's the case, if we should observe some heterogeneity across single and married students, or also if you can identify the nationality of new partners. I think that this is related to some of the last comments of Selena as well. Yeah,
so I think the background of your partners, so we are kind of currently looking into that. So I think what we looked into is, and we are kind of coming from this, kind of cultural assimilation perspective. So I think we looked into whether anything happens in terms of probability of having a Swedish partner. So I think the kind of baseline rates were pretty low. So I think if I recall correctly, we find a kind of a positive estimate, but it's kind of very imprecisely estimated. But I don't think we are even kind of powered to pick up that because, it's again, this kind of joint probability. You would have to have a partner and that partner would have to be of a certain background, right? But right now, I think we also got an interesting comment that whether we do see some, kind of going back to that crowding in effect. So that could also happen if they're more likely to marry kind of their European peers. So it might not happen through kind of the labor market, but just the kind of the marriage market. So we haven't looked into that, but I think that's a kind of fair point. We will look into that. So and again, kind of, I think, but that's also kind of Selena mentioned is that in I highlighted the kind of the most convincing heterogeneity results, but I think we also find that those who are married, they are actually kind of more likely to stay in Sweden in the long. So they have kind of higher treatment effects for this reform. Yeah.
Great.
Thank you. Yeah,
Thank you.
that's super interesting. Sorry, I just had a related question that I was wondering. So for instance, can you tell at least when were people married? I was wondering if there were any compositional changes. So for instance, if now it's more likely to attract already married couples to Sweden, or if you can, I don't know, if you can have a look at that.
Yeah, sure. So I think the one issue is that, so first, as I say, that we kind of, we restrict the sample to people who kind of start before the reform. And that by doing that, we cannot kind of, we are obviously kind of addressing that no kind of change happens in terms of selection for the incoming cohorts. But we have a separate section where we kind of try to get into that whether this reform had an effect on the composition of the incoming cohort. So I think one key challenge with that is that there was a kind of a reform. So there is a tuition fee reform for international students in 2011, and a kind of share of, and a non-negligible share of these master students kind of eventually go into the PhD programs. And if you look at kind of the 2011 cohort, would probably start their PhD in 2013 or 14. So that kind of complicates it a little bit. And there was I think 80% decline in the number of international students for the tuition fee reform. So before 2011, they didn't have to pay any tuition fee. So it kind of basically went up from, I think in dollar terms, probably, so $0 as tuition fees to probably $15,000. I mean, that's kind of still pretty low, but, kind of as long as the demand curve kind of slopes downward, that had a kind of significant reduction. And that kind of complicates this analysis of what happened, or whether anything happened in terms of the composition of the cohorts that actually kind of apply with the knowledge that, I will be more likely to stay in Sweden in the long run, right? So that kind of complicates that analysis a bit. But I think it would be lovely to do. But, governments, did not kind of take into the fact that, we want clean reforms. We did not want kind of many reforms to happen at the same time. So that 2011 reform kind of confounded that piece of it. But yeah, I think that's definitely another important channel through which these reforms can have an effect on the inflow of students, for sure.